There are a number of students painting fur on some kind of animal, whether that's a cat or a dog or whatever, but I wanted to give a demo on how to go about creating that texture because it really is about light and shadow and texture. That sensation, if you were to touch it, it would have a feel to it. So when I'm starting, I always work from dark to light. In this case, I'm working on the kind of dark stripes that you're seeing on the cat's face, and I pay very close attention to the direction of the fur. And this would be the same whether you're looking at a photograph of a dog or a cat. I would always pay attention to the fur direction. I also pay attention to the length of the hair that I'm trying to replicate. This is true if I'm trying to do human hair as well. I look at the length and I try and replicate the shape, the line. I ask myself, is it a curvy line? Is it a diagonal straight line? So it should have a quality about it, and that's what you're trying to kind of copy or mimic when you're working on your painting. And you can see I'm working on those shadow areas first. So I always kind of work my way backwards. I kind of envision like a paint by number, but I'm working in that darker end and slowly moving into the lighter end. When you're working with acrylic paint, it often looks kind of bad before it starts to look good. And I'd argue that with a second or a third coat, it becomes more and more refined and it looks better as you start to layer. So don't be dejected if it doesn't look perfect that first time out. And fur is interesting. It can sometimes bend down, it can point up, it can fan in places, like on that cat's nose, it's kind of angling up. So you just want to pay attention to the angle, the curve, all that stuff. On the nose, the hair is really short, but in other places, the hair is a little bit longer. If I were painting a really light colored animal, like I have a poodle at home who's almost white, they're kind of a cream color, I would still look to the darkest value on that dog. So it may not be like a value number 7 or 8 on the value scale, it may be more in like the mid-tone range, and that's your darkest value, but whatever it is, that's what you would start out with, all those shadow areas. Fur always creates a shadow side, a mid-tone side, and a light side. And then there's a range of values and temperature changes within that. That's the other thing that you should pay attention to. There should be warms and cools within the fur itself. When you're replicating texture, it's a good idea to kind of work with both a skinny brush, but also I'm working with a filbert brush and it's kind of a medium. I ended up using a couple of those green-handled brushes. So it's not always a tiny brush to replicate texture, especially when you're in the block-in phase. Blocking in means like you're kind of making sure that to cover the tone and cover your surface. It's not 100% accurate in terms of every single value, but it's getting the main ones down. Because your first priority is really to cover that tone, and then you can start to work in more of the information. So I always start very loose in my paintings, and then I tighten up as I progress. I am looking for shifts though in value. The right side of this cat's face was more in shadow, the left side was more in light, so you should ask yourself that too. Sometimes you'll have like more neutral lighting, so it's like kind of gray outside, so the animal might be more not quite in harsh shadow, but usually there's a light side and a dark side, and it's important that you realize that. You should also think about painting the animal as a form. So your strokes should kind of wrap around the animal. And that's the great thing about doing fur is that it already does that for you. You just have to pay attention to that fur direction. Like a cat's head is kind of like a sphere shaped, but they have that nose that's similar to a cone. Keep looking for shifts in temperature as well. So there are areas on this cat's face where it kind of falls into the cool ranges, so more like violets or even green in places. And then where it's in the light, you actually see a lot of warmth to it, so oranges and yellows and a little bit of crimson. It's good to also remind yourself about edges. So some edges can be soft and some can be hard. When you're painting fur, it's important that you create more soft edges. So where the fur meets a dark background, or like inside of the cat's ears, for example, you'd want to try and get that to look soft. So it's not like a cutout, it's a very soft, kind of a blurred edge. So that's something that you can try to replicate as well. Things to also look for is coat patterns. So if your pet has a specific pattern on them, like a Rottweiler would have those kind of tan eyebrows, you'd want to include that. My dog has spots on it, and I try and replicate the shape of each spot, although you can generalize if there's a lot. On this cat, there's some like spots on the muzzle area. So you just want to look at that when you're painting your dog or cat or whatever animal. And again, the most important things are the direction of the fur, the length of your brush stroke. It should mimic the length that you're seeing in the photo. So if it's short hairs on the nose or around the eyes, make sure your brushwork is also very short there. If you have longer fur, then your stroke should mimic that as well. And then the direction. So you want to think either curvy or straight or angled. Pay attention to that too. Like with any painting, I'm looking for gradients pretty much everywhere, and it will get stronger with a second or third coat. Because we're pressed for time, I am looking for a 2-coat minimum instead of 3 coats. And you could, in the background, use a fatty brush. I have some really large scale brushes that will work really nicely in doing kind of a looser, more painterly type of background. So that's my intro to fur. It would really need another coat of paint to make that look more rich and to really suggest that fur texture.